I actually have a gift for everyone. So I want you guys to pass this around and just take one tortilla chip. I'm gonna, you're not allowed to have more than one. So, and don't eat it. Sorry. It'll defeat the purpose of what I'm trying to achieve. I guess as it's being passed around, I want you guys to have that tortilla chip as a way to contextualize the conversation I want us all to have. But, show of hands, just for the sake of show of hands, who has a smartphone of any kind? 100% of the room. So a decade ago, smartphones that we have today, with the functionality that we have, would have been over 2 times expensive, if not more. So we've managed to half the price of, the devices we use. The tortilla chip in your hand, however, has gone up by 2.5 times. So the one thing we need to live with and survive with is the one thing that we've managed to not solve for. And how expensive food has gotten and will continue to get is a very scary proposition. So by way of background, I'm Ethiopian. I was raised in Ethiopia in the 80s at the peak of the food crisis. So my natural transition was to become a commodities trader on Wall Street. Now, in 2008, there was something that happened in the commodities markets. Oil hit $150, and global food prices and grain prices hit what was an all-time high. At that point in time, I freaked out. And my freaking out was really driven by a fear that 20 years down the line, there's no way we're going to be able to afford food, personally. So I just kind of developed an obsession around agriculture. I was trading energy at the time, so there wasn't a reason why I should be obsessed with this problem other than I knew the markets. And that obsession eventually led me to quit my job in 2012 to go down this path of trying to help make food cheap and abundant. Now, when I left, it was the beginning of 2012, and what I didn't know was later that year, we'd hit new highs in grain prices. And little did I know that the country I'd chosen to move to, which was Kenya, so I'd left New York and moved to Kenya, would be hit particularly hard by it. See, what happened in 2012 is, in 2011, Kenya had experienced a drought that it was barely recovering from. And as it was starting to recover, a disease had been discovered, a crop disease had been discovered. And just as that disease started to spread, droughts in the US and Russia hit simultaneously. Now, the US and Russia are 2 of the world's largest grain exporting countries. What that meant was that Kenyan corn prices went from being below the global average to being well above the average. And it kept getting worse because what happened was policymakers then adopted a policy of reinstating a 50% import tax on corn. Now, corn in the US might mean something like tortilla chips, high fructose corn syrup, ethanol. Corn in Kenya is what Kenyans eat every single day. It provides almost half the calorie requirements for the country, and the poorest quarter in the country spent about 1/3 of their income on that one grain. Now, when I graduated from college, I remember being told to expect to spend about 1/3 of my salary on rent. So now imagine spending 1/3 of your total income, not on all your food requirements, but on a single good. See, there's no more room for error in the way we think about food and the way we think about food prices. And we're already at a stage when we have no room for error. And errors like the one I gave as an example in Kenya, unfortunately happen all over Africa. And it happens not because policymakers are malicious or malintentioned. It happens because there's a lack of information and clarity in the type of information needed to make the policy decisions being made. Now, fast forward in where we're going to as a world. We're expected to be 9.1 billion people by 2050. As a wealthier population, we're expected to need 70% more food because we consume a lot more than we actually growing as a population. So in a space where there's no room for error, you have this happening with population, and to top it off, you have climate change. The frequency of droughts, floods, wind-related crop damage has grown exponentially such that actually figuring out agricultural production and productivity has become impossible. So what happens next? It's clear we have to increase food production. How does that happen? It's got to happen in one of two ways. We're either going to have to start growing more food on the plots of land that we're growing food in, so increasing yield, or we're going to have to plant new land. Now, I'll argue, as much as I said about Africa, that Africa is actually the place for that to happen. Not only does it have the largest swath of arable land remaining in the world, 4 times the amount in the US, planted across the US today, it also has such low yields that if in 2012, African corn yields were just equivalent to the world average, we could have actually increased corn production by 12% that year. It was a 2% reduction in corn production globally that actually led to that sort of price spike. So imagine what a 12% increase in production can happen. So the next question you ask is, so how are we going to solve this mess? And how do we go about doing that? That's where we like to think of the work that we're doing as being that moonshot around how to address productivity in Africa. We've created a real-time, basically, tracking application that allows all sorts of users, from policymakers to traders, to basically visualize and analyze all sorts of data around agriculture. So the application currently, basically, it's not that the data isn't available, by the way, in terms of what policymakers are using. It's that it's highly disaggregated, it comes in multiple formats, and nobody knows where it sits. So what ends up happening is that a user doesn't know which source to tap for what piece of information. So what we've done is we've created a blank slate. It's a blank slate that actually sucks in and aggregates all sorts of data, over 40,000 indicators that basically look at all sorts of analytics around Africa, African agriculture, but also global agriculture. So metrics from emissions to rainfall to vegetation to production. So what ends up happening is a continent where 30% of its GDP comes from agriculture, less than 1% of outstanding bank loans today are to the agricultural sector. The reason is capital is not available. So what we are trying to do is basically make the data available that lets capital be unleashed. So in this context, now you take your tortilla chips, and I want everybody to imagine being a credit officer for farmers in Nigeria. And you have a Nigerian cassava farmer that comes to your office. In the past, the way decisions are made is a yes or no, and oftentimes it ends with a no. What we're envisioning is a future where if you are a credit officer, you have a tool that lets you go in and look at all sorts of parameters around, say, supply, and the supply of certain different crops that are important in Nigeria. So to give an example, tomatoes. Nigerians are actually one of the largest importers of tomato paste, and wheat. And so it allows you to go in and create this real-time tracking system that allows you to look at a series of these indicators in such a way that you can generate a series of charts. Now, I've kind of fast-tracked this process so that we can get to what we actually track. So we track everything from, so imagine you have a cassava farmer coming in for a loan. Now, cassava to Nigerians is what's equivalent to the corn story that I told you about in Kenya. They eat it every single day. Now, as you can see, cassava production, if you're a credit officer, you have to understand the volatility in production cycles. Now, you'll see in 2009 there was a cassava crisis. You'll want to understand why that happened and how you can think of that differently. That actually happened because there was flooding in the core cassava producing regions of Nigeria at the time. Now, what ends up happening when you have that sort of rainfall and that sort of drop in cassava production is you have a drastic import of wheat. Wheat is the alternative to it. And the US provides 80% of the wheat into Nigeria. And you can track vegetation, so you can actually watch how vegetation in a particular region evolves. By being able to look at and dynamically visualize all this data that is incredibly complex, this is not coming from a single source. Each one looks at various sources to extrapolate what the true numbers should be, because no one source actually tells us what it is. And so what we're hoping is that this tool becomes the tool that allows us to basically unleash capital into African agricultural markets, to increase the yield so that farmers can basically produce more on the existing plots of land, which then feeds into more investment going into all that other arable land that I discussed, which then leads to abundant food and hopefully cheap food. Thanks.
Awesome. Okay, so quick question, Sarah, before you go down, and then we'll take the next one up. So we're going to go to brainstorming, and there's going to be 2 tables who are going to work on this idea. So in addition to all the ideas that they think of, whatever they think of, 2/3 yes and, what kind of distro, technology, partners, money, other ideas that you guys can think of that would help this idea, and then 1/3 yes but, meaning like what are your critiques and challenges you think are there, and some ideas there. Is there any set of things, 1 or 2 things, or that you really need help on right now that you know as you're building?
As we're building, well, there's 2 things I can think of. One is we just actually finished our first fundraise, and we're out there hiring all sorts of talent from front end to back end to machine learning engineers. We need people. And the second is the tool that I showed you, which is the visualization around satellite imagery and weather data. Everything we've done is basically allow it to be animatable. So a user gets to curate their experience and get to zoom into a particular region and then say, I want to understand the 10-day average in this particular region versus the 10-day average there. And so when you're running a series of computations on images that are varying anywhere, that are coming in daily, are varying anywhere from being 50 meters squared to 100 meters squared, you run into all sorts of challenges in terms of giving it to the user. So we're thinking about ways of optimizing that further.
So simplifying.
Simplifying that process.
Figuring out how to interact. Okay.
Yeah, so we're on geospatial. Yeah.
Okay, super.
All right.
Thank you.